I heard that paper a couple times before, and every time I get goosebumps. So, thank you. Yeah. So I just want to start by thanking everyone here, everyone that has stayed throughout this amazing session and also came last night. And thank you, Carrie, for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here and be part of this discussion. So this paper is titled "The Monument is a Concept," but it could just as easily share the title of Uruguayan poet Mario Benedetti's now famous book, El olvido está lleno de memoria, or Forgetting is Full of Memory. For our present concerns, this means that the state's monuments, most often touted as historical, are in fact memorial. That is, the monument represents not only what to remember, but how to remember. Thus, what makes a monument is not its matter, but its meaning as a concept. It is the production of the monument as a mnemonic. What is at stake here is not understanding the political or philosophical difference between history and memory, but the process by which a monument becomes a memorial and a memorial becomes historical. What is at stake is how the concept of history elides other modes of remembering. Let me offer a grounded example from the play Villa by Chilean playwright Guillermo Calderón. Three women, one of which we find out at the play's end is Mapuche, an indigenous people in what's now Chile and Argentina, are charged with the task of deciding how to memorialize a dictatorship period torture center, Villa Grimaldi, also known as the Terra Nova Barracks. And this is an image of the barracks while they were a clandestine torture center. It had been razed to the ground at the end of the dictatorship in 1990. The three women officially have two choices passed down from a prior official bureaucratic process. One, rebuild the torture center with great attention to every detail, turning the space into a hyper-real house of horrors. Or two, build a new contemporary museum, replete with art, artifact, and the latest in computer technology, which is a nod to the Memory Museum, which is in Santiago. But when the three women cast their ballots, a third memorial option emerged anonymously from one of the women, and this option is an anti-colonial practice of memory that rises to the surface of history. Here, memory in the form of a word, the third option is marichiweo, which in the Mapuche language, Maputongon, means we shall triumph tenfold. Marichiweo was chanted by Mapuche warriors before a battle, spoken before a Spanish encounter, and is spoken today. Its meaning has accrued the citations of innumerable utterances from time immemorial, so much so that it is not a hope, but a promise. The voices of the ancestors carried across time to the present. But spoken here in the midst of a process meant to memorialize a national tragedy, Marichiweo not only disrupts popular historical memory that in South America, and particularly the Southern Cone, is often called the recent past, but Marichiweo rather extends memory beyond the temporality of the nation-state or even Spanish colonialism, and in doing so makes present the historical erasure of the Mapuche and their sustained struggle of survivance in the midst of ongoing colonial struggles. Two of the women say that a vote of Marichiweo is equivalent to voting neither, option A or B. Though the equation of neither with Marichiweo, and by equating the evocation of Marichiweo with what the two of the women call a ruined ballot, the play also performs the Chilean erasure of the Mapuche from its memory and its nation. It places the Mapuche in a substitutive relationship with absence. Although Marichiweo is not considered as a relevant choice for the historical monumentalization of the torture site as a metonym of the violence of the dictatorship overall, its presence reveals the inability to represent Chile's recent history without also contending with its ongoing violent relationship to its indigenous populations, and specifically the Mapuche. On the surface of the women's statement of a ruined ballot is the inapplicability of the Mapuche's tenfold triumph as a form of memorialization for the horrors of dictatorial violence that would become a memorial turned historical monument. But just as Marichiueo here stands in for neither option A nor option B, it also emerges as the only legitimate option. Marichiueo insists on contesting the pastness of an ongoing violence by resisting its absence through incorporation into the concept that make meaning of the memorial's material form. It insists that the Mapuche are not a people of the past, but are present, also suffered under dictatorship within and beyond the walls of this torture center, and in continuation of the ongoing colonial violence, which the dictatorship was but an iteration. Neither a memory nor a house of horrors was built. This is an aerial view of Via Grimaldi now, which is called, translated into English, Peace Park Via Grimaldi. Here's some remnants of the stairs of the Terra Nova barracks that are still in the Peace Park. And this is an ombu tree, which grow a lot in Argentina, also the lands of the Mapuche. Was kind of serves multiple purposes here because it was here, of course, much prior to the building of the barracks, but was also used in torture at the clandestine torture center. So I'd like to think not that Marichiueo won the ballot, but that it revealed the choices for a memorial to be limited to the conceptual space of state's history, its temporality, and its inherent territorial limits. Constrained to be historical monuments, these memorials assert the finality and conclusion, the pastness of violence of an ongoing colonialism. In other words, the monument is a concept because history is a concept. Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito says that the concept is, quote, the idea of something complete and definite. The scholar Brett Levinson describes the concept as what organizes and orders our understanding of events. What all this means is that the concept presupposes meaning by way of a formal logic, established by iteration and repetition, which is to say, the process by which the memorial becomes a monument is through the repeated citation of a state's history. As such, conceptualization is training for how we perceive and come to understand history's events. Understood beside Patrick Wolf's off-sided settler colonialism as a structure, not an event, we come to understand the state memorial then as a monument to a history which reasserts its presence, its facticity, and its future, while forgetting those memories not crystallized in the conceptual framing of the monument. But history's fixity is constantly being unsettled by errant memories of ways of remembering that either cannot be or refuse to be constrained to the pastness of a state's monumentalized history. And when you think about the difference between history and memory, many of you might immediately recall the French historian Pierre Nora, his now famous Between Memory and History, Le Lieu de Mémoire, in which he conceives of a trajectory from milieu to lieu, or that is from the environment, or what he calls the real environments of memory, to sites or places of memory, where memory crystallizes and secretes itself. Nora writes that there are places or sites of memory because there are no longer environments of memory. He declares that these real environments of memory are, quote, a historical past that is gone for good, and says that what memories we have now are, quote, nothing more, in fact, than sifted and sorted historical traces. Traces culled from the history of what he describes as, quote, mnemonic authoritarian states. Simply put, Nora argues that what we have now instead of memory is historiography, which he writes is the history of the great historians of Western civilization. And while it may seem convincing in a world in which we currently live that in place of real memory, we have only discursively forged memories of a white and Western civilizational project, such a proposal denies the tension between memory's embodied experience and the common sense or assumption of history. The concept of history is constituted by the fact of the singularity of events and their permanent relegation to the past as history. The political utility of this history requires that the fixity of the past must both be understood as permanent while remaining redefinable for the presentist work for which it is employed. History's pastness and order must always be reiterated for fear that its memorial elisions and erasures will rise to the surface and destroy it, as we have increasingly seen in the past decade here in the US and around the world. The destruction of monuments, for example, is not a matter of erasing history, but rather the surfacing of memory that contests the mnemonic imposition of the monument, that is, that contests how the monument makes us remember. And this destruction happens not primarily at the level of the material, but of the conceptual, such as in the utterance and repetition of Marichiweo. Nora calls this historiographical anxiety that, quote, tasks itself with tracing what he calls the alien impulses within itself, because history, quote, discovers that it is the victim of memories which it has sought to master, end quote. The assertion that history could ever be a victim of alien impulses within itself in this project of mastery already identifies it, history that is, as a tool of the colonial project. Its victimhood is strictly correlative to its attempt at mastery. The task of tracing alien impulses within itself is what reveals history as an always deficient master, reliant on the repeated assertion of its mastery. And I'm thinking about Hegel's production of this subject. But what is this alien something or someone beyond or in excess of a nation's history, which generates this historiographical anxiety and has led to the increased call for and demolition of historical monuments? Is it the continuity, or it is the continuity of indigenous memory since time immemorial? And it is the fact of Black and indigenous presence as the very possibility of the existence of this place upon which monuments, as a repetition of state histories, stand. It is this fact, too, that unsettles the conceptual ground upon which these monuments stand. The alien memory here, which has the power to defy mastery, and thus a tool of anti-colonial practice that insists that the fact of a monument's history is vulnerable. It must always be reasserted or find an abrupt end by its own lack of authority over who or what lives or dies, is erased or elided, or in both history and national memory, whether in stone or bronze or ink. But while history is always trying to reassert its mastery, in part through its monumentalization, we learn something vital from the story of Marichiweo above, which is that forgetting is full of memory.
And as someone that thinks about books, to me, oh yeah.
So the sound is really not good.
Okay. As someone that thinks about books, that's something that I gravitate towards, right? That the book is something that is easily portable. And coming from Ghana, where we don't really have a lot of monuments to our past, but we do have a lot of stories, a lot of text, a lot of things that are passed down through narrative. And so for me, it kind of made sense to think about the way that the book becomes a kind of career of memory. But also recently, I've been thinking quite a bit about poetry and what poetry does in the world. This summer, I was lucky enough to interview an amazing poet, Kofi Anyidoho, who's the last poet I cite. And I asked him, why do we still make and create poetry in a time of crisis? It seems like we are caught in this unending loop of crisis. So why create books when obviously we haven't necessarily learned anything from the thousands of books we've written and created? And he said, because we have to. Where else do we put our stories? Where else do we put our memories? Like, we have to keep producing, even if it feels like no one is listening. Yeah.
I think that the song is and I was thinking thinking about Aretha Franklin recently, and I went to her home just right after she died, and I asked somebody to take me into the neighborhood, a historian who really knew the area very, very well. And Aretha, of course, lived in Detroit. She lived in very, very close to Motown. And the thing that was so extraordinary to me, the thing that was so heartbreaking for me, was that as we drove into this area where the sound that these people made sort of transformed and moved around the world in this extraordinary way. And there was not a marker. There was not a stone. There was not a tablet. There was nothing that said, from this region came some of the most important music, from the United States. And music that still continues to reverberate in all kinds of ways around the world. And yet, I still carry her then to myself, in my heart and in my head. And I listen to her song as a way of remembering not only her, but my life through her. Right?
As I listen to all of you today, I keep thinking that the impulse to memorialize an experience is profoundly human. It's something so deep, whether through a book, through a monument. I mean, I remember and Carrie May's first images of the little teddy bears and the candles, and I did some research deep in the southern Sierra Mountains in Mexico, in the state of Guerrero. I was in the middle of nowhere. I had a 7-hour drive deep into the mountains, right? And I would drive this drive, and roads were washed away part of the way. There were no visible villages nearby for hours. I had to carry my own gas, carry my own water in the back of my truck. And I could see, in fact, my life was saved when I got into a rainstorm and almost went off a cliff, by a little roadside monument that someone had made, memorializing, presumably, the life of someone who died there. And so it strikes me that when we talk about removing these monuments, it strikes such a deep chord. It gets at that impulse for us to memorialize the experience, right? At the same time, these state structures, governments, dictatorships, know that. And they have sort of co-opted that. They have manipulated that impulse to kind of control us and to write our histories and to represent what they want to represent. So I think, yeah, that impulse that underlies it, though, is, and that's, I think, why education is so critical, because the impulse is not an intellectual impulse. It's a visceral impulse to represent my experience, right? But it's sort of been so manipulated, and unless we're educated, we will continue to be manipulated.
Thank you.
Did anybody else have?
Thank you. This is wonderful to hear history, English, and arts all discussed at the same time. And I love the comments earlier about the classroom being the appropriate place for this dialogue. I thought that was extremely strong, since we can't get other forums to address this with intelligence. The classroom seems to be the place. My question is really a large one. It's also trying to be simple, is that monuments are an act of power in the sense of coming to that point, making a statue is an example. But isn't it the truth of history that becomes the question of what is the monument? Isn't history isn't it the goal of the history to be truthful isn't that the monument that we're trying to do here, so that it's not manipulated to become a monument, a statue that hides half of its truth? And the concept that you just raised is an excellent one also. The truth in the roadside dedication to an individual's passing is pure truth and is visceral. But the truth that we see in monuments through a history that is maybe reduced for the sake of making the monument, and then we lose people's personal truth and honesty. It's a general question about, isn't it the accuracy and the truth of history that is the monument we need to deconstruct?
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, if history itself is actually the monument, or an accurate or true history is the monument we're trying always to kind of get to, or trying to get to here. And I wonder, I guess my immediate thought as you were asking that was, how will we actually historicize history, right? How will we contextualize the history that we know and that we accept and understand as historical fact? Because there's always going to be these underlying memories that are elided by history, right? The narrative or narratives of history itself. And so, yeah, maybe in conversation rather than in history with a capital H. I'm not exactly sure, right, how one achieves the contextualization of history itself. But yeah, that's.
I think, so we'll take one more question, which is actually my own. So, all right, y'all. I have what seems like a simple question in my mind, and I love the way you guys sort of are thinking about monuments, especially Delali, yours in terms of literature. And with our recent sort of, everybody's given feedback on books, especially in the state of Florida. If we are contesting monuments, the physical monuments that are downtown, in most downtown areas, does that mean if literature is a place where that can be viewed as a monument, that people then get to contest the existence of that literature?
They already are.
That was going to be my response too. That for me, literature has always been a contested space, right? It's not without its problems, it's not without its own fraught notions of forgetting and rendering invisible. I often think about the example, and I think it was in the talk yesterday, one of the images that you'd shown is the Make America Great Again image. And I think for me, as someone coming from literary studies, that reference is Octavia Butler, the parable of the sower, right? But we don't recognize it as such because of the way that, Trump takes it up and turns it into its own thing. But it seems to me that literature has always been the site of contestation, and particularly as an African, having spent most of my training reading British and American literature, I can see the ways in which that representation is fraught with invisibility, with forgetting, with erasure, with further subjugating people that exist outside the so-called global center.
And I just want to, can I add one thing just about language? Because I'm thinking about my research is in Mapuche poetry, and thinking about the kind of different indexicality of the words in Mapuche, in Maputungun, from words in kind of Western logocentrism. They're kind of self-referential, always kind of differing the meaning that they're trying to get to. So I think in that way, like poetry, and the words used in the poetry in Maputungun carry generational knowledge, right, across millennia. It's kind of in the language itself, so that every utterance is a repetition of something that has been spoken by the ancestors millennia ago. So in that way, right, literature is quite powerful as potentially a monument.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
I have one more question, and I wonder if it's also maybe a question really to the audience, and to the presenters, to everyone. All monuments, one way or another, whatever they are, however they constituted marble, bronze, stone, rock. They're all a call to action in one way or another. They're always a call to either deep reflection or action. And reflection only to the extent that it actually calls you to act. To act in some way in relationship to the thing that's being presented. There's just no, right? They're calling you to act, right? Whether it's you know, through sort of new monuments, new developments, new contemporary artists coming into, you know, Hank's Embrace, or Eric's Embrace project, right? It's asking us to call forth notions of greater humanity and compassion, and then to use that compassion as a way of extending it out and into the world. So right, they're asking us to act. So I'm wondering, in your process and in your work, what are we being called to do? Right? If we're being sort of, you know, sort of deconstructing sort of the role of the state and the role, what are we actually being called to do in relationship to that critique? I'm just wondering. And I'm posing that as a sort of conceptual question for myself, for you, and for the room. What are we actually being called to do? For that matter, what is this process? This process in which we're deconstructing, thinking about, considering monuments, what are we actually being called to do? Right? And so maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that eventually. But thank you so much.